candidate, or the others who are not on the list, to make overtures to Trump. It's a vote killer. So any kind of liaising with the Trump team, with his son-in-law, for example, who seems to be a point man for Mexican relations, will have to be done, tras bambalinas. And I think that will be the likely modus of whoever is elected. There are a number of candidates who are, or potential candidates who are US educated. Vidigaray, I think, went to MIT. Probably, I forget where.
You don't have Rafael Moreno Valle?
Moreno Valle spent some time at Harvard Business School.
He studied here.
Yeah, he did. I think
studied here.
Mead, yes.
Here,
yeah. So I think certain candidates may have, because they have lived in the United States, they may be able to say with some authority, we need to disassociate Trump from the rest of America. We need to remember that it was only a minority of Americans who elected Trump. Not only did he lose the popular vote, if you look at actually the number of people who voted for Trump relative to the adult US population, it was something, it's in the low 20s. 21%, I think I've seen. If you include within the US adult population all of those people who are in jail and therefore not entitled to vote, etc. So that's one strategy. But any attempt to make nice with Trump is campaign suicide.
I certainly would like to put Trump aside from what I'm about to ask. My name is Forrest Cook, by the way, and I'm an attorney here in Austin, but I'm past chairman of the board of Austin Smiles, and it's the Austin Plastic Surgery Foundation, and we primarily go to Guatemala and El Salvador and Mexico. Veracruz is our most common destination, but Puebla was one of our last destinations. It was a great trip. What we do is cleft lip and cleft palate repair on children, craniofacial surgeries, and we pay our own way, and it's all free. But what we'd like to do, or what I'd like to promote within my group, is a better relationship in Mexico. And as Puebla, it was an example. We had meetings with the consulate here, and I chose a couple other destinations, but she was from Puebla, so we went to Puebla, and we just had a wonderful time. And but at first, when we had meetings with the hospital staff and those, they were a little reluctant. Who are you and what are you doing? They've had other medical mission groups come through, maybe with less success than us, but because we don't like to go to one location and not come back. We want to establish a relationship and keep coming back. Our organization is 30 years old. I've been involved on the board for 20 years, so we've been going to El Salvador for 30 years, sometimes twice a year. So I'd like to see or hear from you or your insight of something like our group, which is not the national Operation Smile, although we do the same thing. It's not Smile thing, we do the same thing. But we do it here, we raise funds here, and there we go, and have a week-long trip. They're leaving tomorrow for Guatemala for a week. But this is just a great organization where everybody, the nurses and the anesthesiologists and the doctors, we want to keep going because we get as much out of it or more, these children that we can fix in 2 hours, change their lives. We just want to keep doing it.
Yeah, and you are being good neighborly, and you are contributing.
Well, we don't go where we're not invited, so we often partner with the Rotary. We'll be with the Rotary in Veracruz, and in Puebla, it was the state government that wanted us to operate at the government hospital, not the for-profit children's hospital. And we got to be good neighbors, and we got to honor that we're operating in their hospital. We pay their staff to help us, particularly their nurses, to be overnight.
Well, all I would say is keep doing what you're doing, because it is local level that act as a counter to this rising gringophobia.
Well, something happened.
Well, excuse me, I think
Yes,
it sounds like you've got a very worthwhile organization,
I think we do.
and I appreciate your sharing your mission with us. I'd like to make sure we have time for other comments and
Of
questions.
course, yeah, of
Thank
course.
you.
I'm just saying that in Puebla, we tried to get back the next year, and something happened, politics or something, and maybe something as far as a bigger organization said, well, no, don't.
Well, they have a new governor, so maybe
Yeah,
it's...
that's could be it.
There's a question here.
Go ahead, yeah.
I've just recently been reading some interesting stuff about actually the position of the American president, and in terms of their own role about basically how thin-skinned they are, and that would include George W. Bush, President Truman, Lyndon Johnson, in terms of especially the extremely abrupt transitions that occurred after, say, FDR's death or JFK's, and then the presidents who came in. They were basically not considered people who were as, supremely self-confident as their predecessors, and they were perhaps more amenable to bad advice. So what are your thoughts on, is basically people like their predecessors, they would allow for what was called gestural independence. Say, for example, Charles de Gaulle could, make some statements which would be annoying but tolerated. And so what are your thoughts like, do you feel that President Trump, is he kind of somebody who is, so self-confident that, even if some, verbal, fireworks occur, that is, not going to rub him the wrong way?
Well, that phrase you used, gestural independence, is very interesting. And there's obviously a great tradition of that in Mexico. In terms of Trump, one would like to think that rhetoric is only rhetoric, but we've seen that when Trump tweets that he's going to tear up NAFTA, the peso dives. So this is tangible, and it's a new panorama, completely unprecedented. So in that sense, it's hard to draw historical parallels, because I can't recall. You'd probably have to go back to Jackson Polk. Was that the president who launched the invasion?
James K. Polk.
James K. Polk. I'm sorry. Yeah. Polk. Anyway, to find someone who was so Mexicophobic. But back in those days, there was no Twitter. So
That's right.
Rico, could you take a few questions to make sure that we use the last minutes? If you can take a few, around a few.
What do you mean, take a few?
yeah, what
You're doing, right?
Gather, no.
Take them together, and then I'll just in case there's
Yeah.
some overlap.
Oh,
Thank you.
excellent. That's an excellent idea. So we'll do a series of questions.
Okay.
And then
Joe.
Sure. Hey, Andrew. So, I mean, you're looking a lot at the presidential level and at some of the more kind of critical media like Proceso. If you go down a level and look at kind of the mainstream media and civil society, where do you see the trends with like something like Televisa? What are they doing now? What is their posture? And is that influential above and beyond the political candidates? And the same, what are the potential for things in the United States beneath the level of the presidency to exercise other kinds of soft power to smooth the waters a bit? I mean, are those even perceived, or is it all a perception of Trump?
let's get 2 or 3 questions on the table, and then we can.
Yeah.
Why don't you
My name is Frank Cardenas, and the question that I have is, again, concerning Trump. You know, this increase in anti-Americanism sentiment that has developed since, his presence. Do you think, or what do you think about the fact that if he were to be removed, which I really feel that there's a high chance, would that sentiment, some of that sentiment be reversed? The anti-American?
Yes, in the corner.
I'm curious, so you've told a story of the Mexican election that's very international and looking at the United States, but I'm curious, it seems like the number of independent candidates, people breaking with the PON, people breaking with the PRI, the whole disarray, Peña Nieto's horrible approval ratings, that there's also an important domestic story that explains the rise of AMLO. I'm just curious if you could say a little bit more about that, and whether or not the position vis-a-vis the United States is actually resonating with everyday voters, if there's such a thing.
Right, since we've got a couple of presidential Trumpian questions, let's go for one more question into the loop.
If you had a microphone to speak to all the Mexicans, what would be a good advice to deal with all this what's happening right now?
Small one.
Right, well, I'll start with that last question, actually. My advice to Mexicans, which is obviously common sense, really, is don't confuse the man with the country. When I teach in Mexico, in Aguascalientes and in Mexico City, the two branches of the CIDE. And when this question comes up, which it does fairly often, I try to present a view of the United States which is holistic, as a historian, but also as someone who has lived for 15 years roughly in the United States. Roughly half of my adult life I've lived in Mexico and half in the US, and I make that known, and so I use anecdote, whatever, to try and convey the message, and I think that's how much that is going on, how much that kind of conversation is happening in the public sphere. I really don't know, because the Mexican press is so Trump-centered in its coverage of the United States. It's Trump. Lately, it's been a bit more NAFTA, but then, of course, Trump is constantly pushing himself onto that NAFTA negotiating table, and so it's quite hard to hear anything else at the moment. That said, I would say that the easiest gauge, the quickest gauge, perhaps, is looking at the cartoons that appear. And while there have been a number of cartoons in not only in La Jornada Procesa, but other media depicting Trump with a swastika or a Hitler moustache, there has not yet been very much, at least in these cartoons, of a generalizing of that antipathy towards the US as a whole. I've seen this a little bit, but it's so far it's a sort of minority strain. Okay, Televisa's influence, Joe. Thank you for the TV question. Televisa relies for about 30% of its advertising sales on the federal government. So it's really beholden to the federal government. It's really remained a cheerleader for the president.